future. I know who holds. I know who holds. Who holds. I know who holds tomorrow. Well, I'm going to use the classic greeting I used for 13 years in church plants, now a teenager church in Harrisonburg called Rise. Every single time we gathered for worship and I would kick off whatever the message was, I would say, well, good morning, friends. Good morning. Thank you. Thank you. It is great to be with you. I am so excited that Michelle is getting some leave. I took renewal leave in the summer of 2021, and it was one of the greatest experiences of my life. I did not realize how much I needed it. My only regret was not taking more, if I'm being really honest. But I came back rested in every conceivable way. So when she asked me a while ago to come be with you for a Sunday, I was like, yes. Yes, because I want to meet your wonderful people, and yes, because I want you to be able to take this time. So it is great to have this opportunity. I also want to let you know that I am unusual. So just like, and we're going to do some things today that may feel a little unusual. Don't worry, you're safe. It's all good. I can see your faces. Yeah, I like to mix things up. I like to try new things. What I want to let you know is over the next 5 weeks, it is entirely possible that what you're going to do today won't happen. Michelle encouraged all of the speakers to just do our thing and be authentically us. So what you're going to experience today is sort of authentic to my lived experience and my church experience. This is a long-winded way of saying, if you don't like today, that's okay. Please come back. As somebody who is a church planter, I know the terror actually of handing over your baby to somebody who maybe your people aren't as familiar with and hoping that they will come back. So again, we're going to try some new things today. Please remain open. I hear that you will, but yeah, this probably won't happen every week. All right. The title of the series is Fresh Expressions for the Future Church. And I thought to myself, oops, am I going the wrong way? Yeah. There we go. I thought to myself, well, before we talk about the future church, let's talk about the church in the present. And sometimes when I think about what the church in 2024 feels like, I guess I can only speak for the Virginia Conference United Methodist Church, although I have colleagues in other denominations who resonate with what I'm going to say here. But when I think about the state of the church in the present, and even, I don't know, I might go beyond the church to society and culture in general, what often comes to mind is a hurricane. And I feel like at this point, we're sort of like, I love these people standing here in the front, like, what now? Where do we even begin? So, are you with me? At least a little, right? We have been through some stuff. I'll leave it there. All right, so for the past several years, I kind of feel like we've either seen the hurricane coming, been watching it on Doppler, or we've just sort of been living in it. I don't know, but a lot of us, myself included, have done what seems to make sense when you don't know what to do, and that is you look for experts, right? You try to find people who have some sort of insight, expertise, et cetera, et cetera. Side note, I've learned experts often don't know as much as we think they do. That's a whole nother sermon. But in the church, we have been searching for somebody to tell us where to begin. How do we start to clean up? How do we start to reassemble this thing we call the church? And there have been countless conferences. I just went to one in August in Chicago. There have been countless workshops, countless books, podcasts. Oh, we love our podcasts. And on and on and on. And look, I have done my share of reading and listening and longing, so I am not being critical. But the interesting thing is, I think if we're all really, really honest, which we church folk kind of struggle with that sometimes, we need to stop and acknowledge a profound truth. I'll get to it in a minute. So let's back up. Some of you may remember 2020. And it's so interesting because that was one of those historical phenomena that it will always be pre-COVID and post-COVID, right? It's on the historical timeline. And things profoundly changed. I got so sick of the word unprecedented, I wanted to tear my hair out, right? But the interesting thing about COVID, I realize I'm telling you what you already know, but COVID was the great unveiling, or I often get the image of it's like an enormous mirror was held up to us as a culture, as individuals, as followers of Jesus. We could no longer hide from what we didn't want to face. We just couldn't. And so some people say COVID was the great accelerator. I kind of believe that. It was the great truth teller about what really already existed. And that is this. How many of you all are familiar with this term, the loneliness epidemic? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm not going to go on and on and on about what it is, because I had a sense that you know, right? It's been all over the news. I've pre-COVID, actually, I believe it was Great Britain appointed a minister of loneliness for the British government. They recognized that this loneliness epidemic was such a catastrophic problem, issue, challenge, whatever, that they needed to spend government money to hire somebody to address this. I think that is fascinating, and I tip my hat to our British friends. I wish we would do that. Our own Surgeon General and the CDC, there's a ton of information out there. I found this quote this morning. That's why it's not in the slides, but I love it. I think it sums up what we're talking about as well as anything can. The quote is, "Loneliness and the feeling of being unwanted is the most terrible poverty." Loneliness and the feeling of being unwanted is the most terrible poverty. Guess who said that? Dr. Fauci. Well, that does sound like something Dr. Fauci would say. Mother Teresa. Now, I always joke and say all quotes are attributed to Mother Teresa, Winston Churchill, or Abraham Lincoln. But that does sound like something she would actually say. Loneliness and the feeling of being unwanted is the most terrible poverty, hands down. So, little bit of my lived experience. I saw this coming. You'll hear about that in a minute. I think many of us have lived in the midst of this epidemic of social isolation and significant social mental health challenges, mental and emotional health challenges. But travel back in time with me to the spring semester of 2022. I was leading the teenagers, the preteen church called Rise there in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and we had a deep connection, they still do, with James Madison University. And in the spring of 2022, on the campus of James Madison University, there were 3 student suicides. Meanwhile, about 5 miles down the road from JMU, there was a mass shooting at Bridgewater College, all within the span of basically 3 months. I still pause and think about that period in time and think, wow, there are no words. We were faced with the real life impact of the loneliness epidemic. and what our sense of profound disconnection from the source of life, God, and from one another is doing to us. And so I think this all the time. If the answer is human connection, I mean, it's pretty simple, isn't it? It's the hardest thing I think I've ever faced in my life. Trying to lead in this season. Back particularly when I was full-time pastoring, I would sit with person after person after person. Young adults, middle-aged adults, older adults, really. Because let me be very clear, what we're talking about here transcends all ages, all humans. But I would sit with them and I would listen, and they would share stories of depression, anxiety disorders, on and on and on and on. And they would also share this sense of isolation and the feeling of being unwanted, unseen, unheard, and unwanted. And I would walk away time and time again from these conversations and think, why is this so hard? But let's just be real. It is. Even experts agree. So, pin that if you will, and let's move on. I have this working theory about Jesus, that his life was just one big progressive dinner. If you read the Gospels closely, he was essentially on his way from one meal to the next. The man loved to eat. I respect it. And evidently he loved to eat meals where they were all on one side of the table too. But here's my point. Beautiful things happen around the table. And the very heartbeat of who Jesus was, I would say was relationships. Human connection. Pretty much every story in there, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, etc., is a story of beautiful, holy, sacred, messy relationships. Because you see, he spent his life in the middle of the mess. Over and over and over again, we hear stories. The story of Zacchaeus is always the one that comes to mind, and then one you're going to explore deeply here in a little bit. But, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. I could go on and on and on. It's all about relationships. And the way he stepped into those highly anxious, awkward, messy spaces and transformed them. So, again, travel back in time with me to 2019. If I'm really honest, I think this started in 2018. Okay, so you remind me of a Northern Virginia version of my church plant that will turn 14. Oh my gosh, how is that possible? In September. But we had what many affectionately call the TED Talk rock band vibe for years and years and years. In fact, I was here a few minutes ago, just like traveling back in time. And we worshiped in some of the funniest places. The bar of an Ethiopian restaurant, a community theater where like an occasional mouse would run up the aisle. It was never a dull moment, which is how I like it. But in 2018-ish, 19-ish, I remember feeling that something was just off. I could feel myself fighting an inner sense of remarkable discontent. Not that that's that unusual for me. I struggle with feeling satisfied. But I was like, something is just off. And so I started talking to some trusted leaders like, hey, are you getting this? And they're like, yeah, things feel stale, right? It just feels like we're up there going through the motions most weeks. And I would argue to a certain extent, sometimes that's life, right? But we started asking really serious questions about what's going on. And we had these long, we love to talk, long conversations as a leadership team about how it just felt like putting on the show every week. And we started to ask questions about, well, if the purpose of what we're doing, if our why is transformation, is that happening? And the resounding response that I felt like the Spirit was saying was like, no, not really. There was an enormous disconnect between the TED Talk rock band show and what was happening relationally in our community. So we started having more conversations about how can we mix this up? How can we rethink worship, at least sometimes, in a way that will lead to deeper, more meaningful relationships? You know, the kind of relationships where you feel safe sharing what you're really afraid of, where you feel safe talking about your other relationships that are not doing well. The kind of relationships where you feel seen and heard and valued. If you've ever experienced what I'm describing here, you know. When you know, you know. And so, right about the time, this always cracks me up in retrospect, we decided in Lent of 2020, we were going to have a worship series, and man, we were going to be brave. And we were going to mix it up. And we were going to make people talk to each other, like in the worship service. And we were going to do this, and we were going to do that. And it was going to start the weekend of March 15th, 2020. Hence, be careful what you ask for. We always joked and said, it was like, my worship leader at the time, she was hilarious, but we have laughed so many times about how ready we were, and we were convinced we had the courage, and she was like, and then it was like the universe said, hold my beer. But, needless to say, we were forced to adapt, and adapt quickly. And the adaptation was profoundly painful. You remember, it hasn't been that long. Disorienting, messy. Oh, the stories we could probably all tell, right? Particularly from that era. But some beautiful things emerged from that time too. Because none of us had the energy to put on the mask anymore. We had to get more comfortable laughing at ourselves. We had to get more comfortable wrestling with hard questions. Oh, we thought we were great at that before. Yeah. And then we learned some incredible lessons about human connection and human disconnection and God's phenomenal gift of relationship. We learned that first and foremost, we are created for relationship with our Creator and the creation. That's very vast. That includes our fellow human beings. And we remembered that the church, ourselves included, had forgotten that. Here's the thing. If we're going to talk about the future of the church, it all begins with relationship. Nothing else matters until we can start to have honest conversations about what it means to invest deeply in authentic, vulnerable relationships. And the other thing we learned along the way is that doing so requires an enormous amount of courage, right? We know Brene Brown, Courage to Heal, et cetera, et cetera. She's onto something. And it requires real authenticity and vulnerability and practice. The wisdom of our ancestors in the faith is this thing called spiritual practices. And I am of the mindset now that those are just about more important than anything, and that those spiritual practices all point us toward relationship with our Creator and relationship with our fellow human beings and the vastness of creation. But we have to practice. This is like building a muscle. So here's where it gets a little odd, and they promise me you'll be cool with this. So we're going to practice in real time. We're going to take about 10 minutes-ish, but around 10 minutes. And I'm going to ask you to break into groups of 3 to 5. Please, no more than 5, somewhere between 3 and 5. And just so we can hear each other, if we could try to spread out around this room.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So there's some pieces of paper that were at the front door on your way in. There's a number in the upper right-hand corner. So if you don't have one, it's okay. I can bring you one. But that number is ideally the group you would kind of walk over to. So if you have a 1 on there, raise your hands. Okay, we're going to start with the 1s down here. So odd numbers along this side, 1, 3, 5, 7. And then we'll do the even numbers, 2, 4, 6, and 8. And feel free to move the chairs around if you need to. Why don't you come on up and move to those corners? And then honestly, if you don't have one of the pieces of paper, it's okay, just find a group. And if you're a 9 or a 10, just sort of sprinkle yourselves in amongst the other groups.
And once you get in your groups, I have a couple more things to tell you, but find your people. So here's a little bit, just a few more instructions, fine print, whatever you want to call it. I thought, honestly, about reading the scripture this morning, and then the more I sat with this, the more I was like, no, I think it would be more powerful if they read the story in their groups. So figure out as a group how you want to do this. If you want to each read it silently, that's cool. You'll find it with the QR code. If you want to take turns reading aloud, if one person wants to read it aloud, it's up to you. But please do sit with the text. This is a powerful story about relationship. So much goodness here. And so you will be able to follow the questions. Now, here's the thing. You're probably not going to have time to get to all the questions. I told you I'm the queen of questions, so I gave you a lot. You do not have to. Please hear me. You do not have to answer every question. This is not a test. So if you want to just pick certain ones and respond to those, let the Spirit guide your time together and just explore what you want to explore of the questions. We will give you about a 3-minute warning and then a 1-minute warning, okay? Just so you kind of know where you are, because I don't want you to have to be focused on time too much. All right, ready? And go.
Thank you. And for those at home, the QR code is there on the slide, or the link you can use to follow the. All right, everyone. Lots of good discussion going on, so it's hard to break it up, but there's no reason to move. You can stay right where you are. But we're gonna basically give you all a chance to share a little bit about what you talked about.
Yeah. I was just saying to Ryan, I realize we gave you like this much time for this much content. I do realize that. And Ryan was saying that you can continue the conversation using your app.
Yeah, there's the sermon discussion thread that's part of the app, could be used to kind of keep working on these questions or share observations going forward this week. So
yeah,
there's a lot here.
Or, I like to say, talk about it over lunch, get together with some friends, please keep the conversation going. I'm very biased, but I think there's some really rich stuff in those questions. So let's take a few minutes for those in the room who feel so inclined to share. Was there anything shared in your group that really resonated with you, that you could really connect with, or that made you say, wow, I never thought about that?
We had, and I probably don't need a mic or anything.
Oh, but this way people online can hear you.
Thank you. Well, I felt like our conversation was talking about how different ages and stages in life, you can feel that loneliness epidemic, because we were kind of seeing it as like, and also different places, like new job, that you come into a place and you might be having that feeling of unwelcome, or even a church, but it was also like we were saying high school and then senior citizens, different places, because we're stuck in different areas and they're suddenly thrown in. Guess what? You just moved to the school and now you have to make friends with kids that have been there for like 10, 15 years, even a new teacher coming in, and suddenly you're there. Or senior citizens, I just moved, or I've been living in the same area, but I can't get out very easily. So, there's a lot of different aspects that we saw of different ages and stages.
Amen. Thank you. Yeah, the feeling of being on the outside, one of the worst feelings. Absolutely. Others, what made you go, wow, aha, or what resonated? Yes.
So our group had a lot of discussion about the watering hole, the common area where people could gather, going back to the fundamentals of school, and then the pros and cons of our post-COVID world, and including our people online visiting today. There's the pros and cons because, for example, if you couldn't make it in person today, it's great because you can join online. It broadens the scale, because we think about, at work, those little things where you come to a meeting early, you chit chat, and then you get down to business. But what if you're confined to a meeting space that only fits 10 people, but 100 want to attend? Now we can broaden and be more inclusive, even though everyone is different and meets in different ways. But part of that was different mindsets and personalities, introverts, extroverts. Sometimes in those in-person settings, an extrovert might overpower, whereas in this hybrid setting, the introverts can at least get their thoughts out by putting it in a chat and in writing. So we're thinking about the watering hole and what brought them together to begin with, where Jesus saw and said, here's my water.
I love it. You so beautifully articulated when I briefly referred to the lessons learned when we had to adapt very quickly in 2020, and that continued. This is exactly what you're saying. What we discovered is there's so much beauty when we are able to name every voice is a gift from God and should be heard in some way. We are all theologians. I firmly believe that. The trick is how you amplify all of the voices. I love that. Others.
Oh, Christina.
In our group, we talked a lot about the importance of building relationships when you're at work. And sometimes you don't always see that you're building relationships, but then you discover, oh, I can share this with somebody that I'm talking to about something that has nothing related to work. As a math teacher, I really feel like my least important thing about my job is teaching them math. The most important thing is making sure they're safe and feel connected and heard at school. And I think that, and we've discussed in the group about making sure that we do that in all aspects of all of our jobs.
Amen. Anyone else? I was able to join a group in the back there a little bit, and there was actually, I thought, a fascinating conversation about question 1. And it was sort of a, how did we get here kind of question. Late stage capitalism was brought up. It was all a thing. But actually,
Big 10 minutes.
I know, right? I know, we covered a lot. But this idea that relationships have become transactional, which actually, if it's transactional, it's not a real relationship, but that's a whole nother conversation. But this sense that time is money, and relationships and human connection, they take time. They take work, they take practice. And so if all you ever hear is stay on task, stay on schedule, time is money, be productive, that directly contradicts so much of what Jesus is about. Also, when you hear this message from the time you're knee-high to a grasshopper on, when you hear this message that you must be perfect, your product must be perfect, nothing matters more than the quality of your work, well, relationships are messy. And it is hard, speaking from experience, to fight the voices that say you are not good enough, your product is not good enough. If you choose to stay in this messy zone called relational work and relational commitments, it's really hard to hold those two together. Let's just name the truth. And we try to do that in the church, don't we? We try to hold all of that together. And I'm in that space with you as we're trying to figure out the future of this beautiful mess we call the church. Jesus hung out with hot messes. I mean, the disciples were a dumpster fire, let's be honest. And yet, here we are. Not much has changed. I just happen to think they were a little more honest than many of us are. Any other thoughts? Yes.
I'll say this. All interactions are not built equally. And so I think there's this I'll start off. All interactions are not built equally. And I think there's this misconception that somehow virtual tools allows you to build that connection. But I would argue it's not really the connection that people are seeking. There is a different type of connection, and I see this all the time, especially at work, where when you interact with someone in person, it makes a huge difference. Something from as simple as, let's say you're texting a friend and you start arguing about something, and then you interact with them in person, you realize, oh, we're saying the same thing. Or just you get more engagements in in-person meetings, so people are more likely to ask questions because they can gauge other people's reaction. And even sometimes in meetings, something may be said and no one will respond. Well, if you're virtual, right, you don't know how everyone is reacting, but if you're sitting in a room and you see the reactions, no one says anything, but you know what everyone. So I think even though technology had advanced, I think people are still craving that in-person interaction and connection. And I don't think like Facebook and Instagram or even the app is enough to bring that connection. That's part of the reason that we're seeing an epidemic of loneliness.
Beautifully said. All right, well, I'm going to completely be a hypocrite and say, for the sake of time, I do want to honor your time, and I don't want to end this conversation. So I hope you'll continue talking about this. I am very, very biased in that I believe we have to begin wrestling with these kind of conversations when we're talking about the future of the church. Nothing matters more than what just happened in this holy space. Nothing matters more than relationships.